the shadows chase. The night was colder than it should have been. Nathan tugged his jacket tighter, his breath fogging in the air as he quickened his pace through the dimly lit park. It had started as an innocent walk to clear his mind. The stress of work, the loneliness that gnawed at him, they all seemed to dissipate under the open sky. But now, something felt off. The shadows moved strangely. He stopped at a bench under a flickering street lamp, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The wind whispered through the skeletal trees, carrying with it a sound he couldn't place. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the distant hum of cars. It was something else, faint, rhythmic. Footsteps. Nathan turned quickly, scanning the path behind him. Nothing. Just the empty stretch of pavement, swallowed by darkness.
Get a grip,
He muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease. But his feet moved faster now, each step louder in the stillness. As he reached the edge of the park, the sound grew closer. Heavy, deliberate steps, perfectly mirroring his own. He stopped abruptly, heart pounding, and the footsteps stopped too. Cold dread seeped into his chest.
Who's there?
He called, his voice cracking. Silence. Nathan's hand tightened around his phone in his pocket, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial. He forced himself to keep walking, but the sense of being followed gnawed at him. It wasn't paranoia. He could feel it. The weight of eyes on his back, the subtle vibration of steps too perfectly in sync with his own. He glanced over his shoulder. For a moment, the shadows seemed to ripple, as if something had just darted out of sight. His pace quickened into a jog, then a run. The footsteps behind him matched his speed, pounding relentlessly against the pavement. The park was a maze at night. He veered off the main path, plunging into the darker, unlit trails. Branches clawed at his jacket as he ran, the cold air slicing through his lungs. The sound of his pursuer grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind him. He didn't dare look back. Finally, Nathan stumbled into a clearing, his legs burning, his breath ragged. He collapsed onto the damp grass, clutching his chest as he fought to catch his breath. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, he thought he was safe. Then he saw it. Across the clearing, a figure emerged from the shadows. Nathan's stomach dropped. It was him. Or rather, something that looked like him. An almost perfect reflection, down to the same jacket, the same disheveled hair. But the eyes were wrong. They glowed faintly, like embers, and the expression on its face was a twisted mockery of his own. The figure tilted its head, studying him with a cruel curiosity. Then it began to walk toward him. Nathan scrambled to his feet, backing away.
Stay back,
He shouted, his voice trembling.
What do you want?
The figure didn't respond. Its steps were slow, deliberate, as if savoring his fear. Nathan turned and bolted back into the trees, his mind racing. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. And yet, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Faster now, more insistent. Branches tore at his face and arms as he ran, the darkness pressing in around him. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. The thing was closer, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, and inhuman, as if it were a puppet on strings.
Leave me alone.
Nathan screamed, his voice breaking. But the figure only laughed, a sound that was both his own voice and something far more sinister. He burst out of the woods and onto a quiet street. His legs felt like lead, but he didn't stop running. Houses lined the street, their windows dark and lifeless. He pounded on the nearest door, yelling for help, but no one answered. The street felt wrong, like a half-remembered dream, familiar but distorted. Nathan turned, his back against the door, and froze. The figure stood in the middle of the street, its head tilted in that same mocking way. But now, it was holding something. A long, jagged shard of glass, its edge catching the pale light of the moon.
You can't run from yourself,
It said, its voice a perfect echo of his own. Nathan's blood ran cold. The figure stepped closer, the glass glinting in its hand. Desperation surged through him. He grabbed a loose brick from the porch and hurled it at the figure. It shattered against its chest, but the thing didn't flinch. Instead, it smiled wider, the glow in its eyes intensifying.
What do you want from me?
Nathan choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure stopped, its grin fading.
I am you.
It said,
Everything you fear, everything you've buried, you can't hide from me forever.
Before Nathan could react, the figure lunged. He dodged, the shard of glass narrowly missing his face. He ran again, his mind a blur of panic and disbelief. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the pain in his lungs, the cold air slicing through his throat, the sound of his own distorted laugh chasing him, they were all too real. Nathan didn't know how long he ran. The world around him became a haze of darkness and noise. Eventually, he stumbled to a halt, collapsing onto the ground. He was back in the park, the faint light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The figure was gone. Nathan sat there trembling as the first rays of sunlight pierced the trees. His reflection in the frost-covered puddle at his feet seemed normal, just him. But as he stared, he noticed something. His shadow, stretching long and dark in the morning light, moved slightly, independently. It tilted its head and smiled. Nathan tried to convince himself it had been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. He spent the rest of the day in his apartment, curtains drawn, the doors bolted, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. When night fell, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he glanced at his reflection, in the bathroom mirror, in the darkened screen of his laptop, it felt like something was off. His eyes lingered too long, his movements slightly delayed. By midnight, the silence in his apartment was unbearable. He turned on the television, letting the low hum of voices fill the room. The news anchor's words blurred into static, and Nathan's eyelids grew heavy. He was just starting to drift off when a sound jolted him awake. Knocking. Soft, deliberate, coming from his front door. Nathan froze, his heart pounding. The knocking came again, louder this time. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped back, trying to steady his breathing. Then, from behind him, he heard the faintest whisper.
You can't run.
He spun around, his eyes darting across the room. There was no one there. But his shadow on the wall, it didn't match his movements. It stood still, its head tilted in that same mocking way. Panic overtook him. Nathan grabbed his keys and bolted out of the apartment, not stopping until he was outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. The city streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by an oppressive stillness. As he turned a corner, he saw it again. The figure, standing under a flickering street lamp, waiting for him. Its glowing eyes met his, and it raised a hand in a slow, mocking wave. Nathan ran. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't dare stop. The figure's laughter echoed behind him, growing louder, closer. It wasn't just a sound. It was inside his head, a cacophony of every fear he'd ever tried to bury. He stumbled into an alley, his back pressed against the cold brick wall. The figure was there, blocking the exit. Its smile was gone, replaced by something colder, more menacing.
You can't escape me.
It said, its voice a twisted mirror of his own.
I am every doubt, every failure, every fear you've tried to forget. And now, you will face me.
Nathan's hands clenched into fists. He was tired of running, tired of being afraid.
I won't let you control me.
He said, his voice trembling but resolute. The figure tilted its head, as if amused.
Then fight me!
Nathan lunged, his fist colliding with the figure's chest. It felt solid, real. They grappled in the narrow alley, shadows twisting and writhing around them. The figure's strength was overwhelming, its movements inhumanly fast. But Nathan fought with everything he had, fueled by a desperate need to reclaim himself. Finally, he managed to knock the shard of glass from the figure's hand. It clattered to the ground, and he grabbed it, the jagged edge cutting into his palm. The figure lunged at him, and Nathan thrust the shard forward, driving it into its chest. The figure let out a guttural scream, its glowing eyes widening. Its form began to waver, flickering like a dying flame. Nathan watched, his chest heaving, as the figure dissolved into shadows, leaving only the shard of glass behind. For a moment, there was silence. Then the shadows on the walls began to shift, converging into a single, familiar shape. Nathan's own shadow stretched before him, its head tilted in that mocking way. But this time, it didn't smile. It bowed. Nathan dropped the shard and stumbled out of the alley, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. He didn't know what had happened, or if the figure was truly gone. But for the first time in years, he felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. The battle wasn't over, but now he knew he could fight. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more content like this.